See you on God. Hello, all. Let's just say, yeah, good evening and Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 21, part A of reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an Inquiry into Values by Robert M. Pirsig. I know that the acting chairman admitted him during the chairman's absence on the basis of his teaching experience and apparent ability to converse intelligently. What he actually said is lost. Afterward, he waited for a number of weeks for the chairman to return in hopes of obtaining a scholarship. But when the chairman did appear, an interview took place, which consisted essentially of one question and no answer. The chairman said, "What is your substantive? Yeah, that's what it says. Substantive field." Phaedra said, "English composition." The chairman bellowed, "That is a methodological field." Methodological field. And for all practical purposes, that was the end of the interview. After some inconsequential conversation, Phaedra stumbled, hesitated, and excused himself, then went back to the mountains. This was a characteristic of his that had failed him out of the university before. He had gotten stuck on a question and hadn't been able to think about anything else, while the classes moved on without him. This time, however, he had all summer to think about why his field should be substantive or methodological. And all that summer, that is what he did. In the forest near the timberline, he ate Swiss cheese, slept on pine bough beds, drank mountain stream water, and thought about quality and substantive and methodological fields. Substance doesn't change. Method contains no permanence. Substance relates to the form of the atom. Method relates to what the atom does. In technical composition, a similar distinction exists between physical description and functional description. A complex assembly is best described first in terms of its substances, its sub-assemblies and parts. Then, next, it is described in terms of its methods, its functions, as they occur in sequence. If you confuse physical and functional description, substance and method, you get all tangled up, and so does the reader. But to apply these classifications to a whole field of knowledge, such as English composition, seemed arbitrary and impractical. No academic discipline is without both substantive and methodological aspects. I keep looking at that word, substantive, substantive. I've heard of it. And quality had no connection, but my brain's trying to place it. Like, what? That he could see with either one of them. Quality isn't a substance, neither is it a method. It's outside of both. If one builds a house using the plumb line and spirit level methods, he does so because a straight vertical wall is less likely to collapse, and thus has higher quality than a crooked one. Quality isn't method, it's the goal toward which method is aimed. Substance and substantive really corresponded to object and objectivity, which he'd rejected in order to arrive at a non-dualistic concept of quality. When everything is divided up into substance and method, just as when everything is divided up into subject and object, there's really no room for quality at all. His thesis could not be a part of substantive field, because to accept a split into substantive and methodological was to deny the existence of quality. If quality was going to stay, the concept of substance and method would have to go. That would mean a quarrel with the committee, something he had no desire for at all. But he was angry that they should destroy the entire meaning of what he was saying with the very first question, substantive field. What kind of Procrustean bed were they trying to shove him into, he wondered. He decided to examine more closely the background of the committee and did some library digging for this purpose. He felt this committee was off in some entirely alien pattern of thought. He didn't see where this pattern and the large pattern of his own thought joined together. He was especially disturbed by the quality of the explanations of the committee's purpose. They seemed extremely confusing. The entire description of the committee's work was a strange pattern of ordinary enough words put together in a most unordinary way, so that the explanation seemed far more complex than the thing he was trying to have explained. This wasn't the bells ringing he'd heard before. He studied everything he could find that the chairman had written, and here again was found the strange pattern of language seen in the confusing description of the committee. It was a puzzling style because it was a committee. It was completely different from what he'd seen of the chairman himself. The chairman, in a brief interview, had impressed him with great quickness of mind and an equally swift temper. And yet here was one of the most ambiguous, inscrutable styles Phaedrus had ever read. Here were encyclopedic sentences that had left subject and predicate completely out of shouting distance. Parenthetic elements were unexplainably inserted inside other parenthetic elements, equally unexplainably inserted into sentences whose relevance to the preceding sentences in the reader's mind was dead and buried and decayed long before the arrival of the period. But more remarkable of all were the wondrous and unexplained proliferations of abstract categories that seemed freighted with special meanings that never got stated and whose content could only be guessed at. These piled one after another so fast and so close that Phaedrus knew he had no possible way of understanding what was before him, much less take issue with it. At first, Phaedrus presumed the reason for the difficulty was that all this was over his head. The articles assumed a certain basic learning which he didn't have. Then, however, he noticed that some of the articles were written for audiences that couldn't possibly have this background, and this hypothesis was weakened. His second hypothesis was that the chairman was a technician, a phrase he used for a writer so deeply involved in his field that he'd lost the ability to communicate with people outside. But if this were so, why was the committee given such a general, non-technical title as Analysis of Ideas and Study of Methods? And the chairman didn't have the personality of a technician, so that hypothesis was weak too. In time, Phaedrus abandoned the labor of pounding his head against the chairman's rhetoric and tried to discover more about the background of the committee, hoping that would explain what this was all about. This, it turned out, was the correct approach. He began to see what his trouble was. The chairman's statements were guarded by enormous labyrinth fortifications that went on with such complexity and massiveness. It was almost impossible to discover that in the world it was inside them he was guarding. I was thinking about like people that are so into like how he was talking about layering things within sentences and all of that kind of stuff. Like they have got to be like having some super deep thoughts within themselves, and does their mind ever turn off? Like I have no idea. And also I was wondering, can they go through their everyday life, or do they require assistance? Like, would they be able to function going to a store and doing, you know what I mean? I don't know. The inscrutability of all this was the kind of inscrutability you have when you suddenly enter a room where a furious argument has just ended. Everyone is quiet. No one is talking. Like, would they think that those tasks are like beneath them or like mundane or whatever? Anyway, I have one tiny fragment of Phaedrus standing in the stone corridor of a building evidently within the University of Chicago, addressing the assistant chairman of the committee like a detective at the end of a movie, saying, "In your description of the committee, you have omitted one important name." "Yes," says the assistant chairman. "Yes," says Phaedrus omnisciently. I think it's omnisciently. I'm not sure. "Aristotle." The assistant chairman is shocked for a moment, then, almost like a culprit who has been discovered but feels no guilt, laughs loud and long. "Oh, I see," he says. "You didn't know anything about." Then he thinks better of what he is going to say and decides not to say anything more. We arrived at the turnoff of Crater Lake and go up a neat road. That's crazy because I did a paper in school on Crater Lake. And go up, and for some reason I was really drawn to it, a neat road in the national park, clean, tidy, and preserved. It really shouldn't be any other way, but this doesn't win any prizes for quality either. It turns it into a museum. This is how it was before the white man came. Beautiful lava flows and scrawny trees and not a beer can anywhere. But now that the white man is here, it looks fake. Maybe the National Park Service should set just one pile of beer cans in the middle of all that lava, and then it would come to life. The absence of beer cans is distracting. At the lake, we stop and stretch and mingle affably with a small crowd of tourists holding cameras and children yelling, "Don't go too close," and see cars and campers with all different license plates, and see the Crater Lake with a feeling of, well, there it is, just as the pictures show. I watch the other tourists, all of whom seem to have out-of-place looks too. I have no resentment at all this, just a feeling that it's all unreal, and that the quality of the lake is smothered by the fact that it's so pointed to. You point to something as having quality, and the quality tends to go away. Quality is what you see out of the corner of your eye, and so I look at the lake below, but feel the particular quality from the chill, almost frigid sunlight behind me, and the almost motionless wind. Why did we come here? Chris says. To see the lake. He doesn't like this. He senses falseness and frowns deep, trying to find the right question to expose it. I just hate this, he says. A tourist lady looks at him with surprise and resentment. Well, what can we do, Chris? I ask. We just have to keep going until we find out what's wrong or find out why we don't know what's wrong. Do you see that? He doesn't answer. The lady pretends not to be listening, but her motionlessness reveals that she is. We walk toward the motorcycle, and I try to think of something, but nothing comes. I see he's crying a little and now looks away to prevent me from seeing it. We wind down out of the park to the south. I said the assistant chairman for the Committee on Analysis of Ideas and Study of Methods was shocked. What he was so shocked about was that Phaedrus didn't know he was at the locus of what is probably the most famous academic controversy of the century, what a California university president described as the last attempt in history to change the course of an entire university. Phaedrus just read and turned up a brief history of that famous revolt against empirical education that had taken place in the early 30s. The Committee on Analysis of Ideas and Study of Methods was a vestige of that attempt. The leaders of the revolt were Robert Maynard Hutchins, who had become president of the University of Chicago, Mortimer Adler, whose work on the psychological background of the law of evidence was somewhat similar to work being done at Yale by Hutchins, Scott Buchanan, a philosopher and mathematician, and most important of all for Phaedrus, the present chairman of the committee, who was then a Columbia University Spinozist, Spinozist, and medievalist. Adler's study of evidence, cross-fertilized by a reading of classics of the Western world, resulted in a conviction that human wisdom had advanced relatively little in recent times. He consistently harked back to St. Thomas Aquinas, who had taken Plato and Aristotle and made them part of his medieval synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian faith. The work of Aquinas and of the Greeks, as interpreted by Aquinas, was to Adler the capstone of the Western intellectual heritage. Therefore, they provided a measuring rod for anyone seeking the good books. And the Aristotelian tradition, as interpreted by the medieval scholastics, man is counted a rational animal, capable of seeking and defining the good life and achieving it. When this first principle about the nature of man was accepted by the president of the University of Chicago, it was inevitable that it would have educational repercussions. The famous University of Chicago Great Books program and the reorganization of the university structure along Aristotelian lines, and the establishment of the college, in which a reading of classics was initiated in 15-year-old students, were some of the results. Hutchins had rejected the idea that an empirical scientific education could automatically produce a good education. Science is value-free. The inability of science to grasp quality as an object of inquiry makes it impossible for science to provide a scale of values. Adler and Hutchins were concerned fundamentally with the oughts of life, with values, with quality, and with foundations of quality in theoretical philosophy. Thus, they had apparently been traveling in the same direction as Phaedrus, but had somehow ended with Aristotle and stopped there. There was a clash. Even those who were willing to admit Hutchinson's preoccupation with quality were unwilling to grant the final authority to the Aristotelian tradition to define values. They insisted that no values could be fixed and that a valid modern philosophy need not reckon with ideas as they are expressed in the books of ancient and medieval times. The whole business seemed to many of them merely a new and pretentious jargon of weasel concepts. Phaedrus didn't know quite what to make of this clash, but it certainly seemed to be close to the area he wished to work in. He also felt that no values can be fixed, but that this is no reason why values should be ignored or that values do exist as reality. He also felt antagonistic to the Aristotelian tradition as a definer of values, but he didn't feel this tradition should be left unreckoned with. The answer to all this was somehow deeply enmeshed in it, and he wanted to know more. Of the four who had created such a furor, the present chairman of the committee was the only one now left. Perhaps because of this reduction in rank, but perhaps for other reasons, his reputation among persons Phaedrus talked to wasn't one of geniality. Geniality? Geniality. His geniality was confirmed by none and sharply refuted by two. One, the head of a major university department, who described him as a holy terror, and another who held a graduate degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago, who said the chairman was well known for graduating only carbon copies of himself. Oh, wow. That's not cool. Neither of these advisors was by nature vindictive, and Phaedrus felt what they said was true. This was further confirmed by a discovery made at the department office. He wanted to talk to two graduates of the committee to find out more of what it was about, and had been told that the committee had granted only 2 PhDs in its history. Apparently, to find room in the sun for a reality of quality, he would have to fight and overcome the head of his own committee, whose Aristotelian outlook made it impossible even to get started, and whose temperament appeared to be extremely intolerant of opposing ideas. It all added up to a very gloomy picture. He then sat down and penned to the chairman of the committee on analysis of ideas and methods at the University of Chicago a letter which can only be described as a provocation to dismissal, in which the writer refuses to skulk quietly out the back door, but instead creates a scene of such proportions the opposition is forced to throw him out the front door, thus giving weight to the provocation it didn't formally have. Afterward, he picks himself up out of the street, and after making sure the door is completely closed, shakes his fist at it, dusts himself off, and says, "Oh well, I tried," and in this way absolves his conscience. Phaedrus' provocation informed the chairman that his substantive field was now philosophy, not English composition. However, he said the division of the study into substantive and methodological fields was an outgrowth of the Aristotelian dichotomy of form and substance, which non-dualists had little use for, the two being identical. He said he wasn't sure, but the thesis on quality appeared to turn into an anti-Aristotelian thesis. If this was true, he had chosen an appropriate place to present it. Great universities proceeded in a Hegelian fashion, and any school which could not accept a thesis contradicting its fundamental tenets was in a rut. This, Phaedrus claimed, was the thesis the University of Chicago was waiting for. He admitted the claim was grandiose, and that value judgments were actually impossible for him to make, since no person could be an impartial judge of his own cause. But if someone else were to produce a thesis which purported to be a major breakthrough between Eastern and Western philosophy, between religious mysticism and scientific positivism, he would think it of major historic importance, a thesis which would place the university miles ahead. In any event, he said, no one was really accepted in Chicago until he rubbed someone out. It was time Aristotle got his. Just outrageous. And not just provocation to dismissal either. What comes through even more strongly is megalomania, delusions of grandeur, of complete loss of ability to understand the effect of what he was saying to others, staying on others. He had come so caught up in his own world of quality metaphysics he couldn't see outside, if any more. And since no one else understood this world, he was already done for. I think he must have felt at the time that what he was saying was true, and it didn't matter. If his manner or presentation was outrageous or not. There was so much to it, he didn't have time for prettying it up. If the University of Chicago was interested in the aesthetics of what he was saying rather than the rational content, they were failing their fundamental purpose as a university. That was it. He really believed. It wasn't just another interesting idea to be tested by existing rational methods. It was a modification of the existing rational methods themselves. Don't go hang, you, and a good chance. Love you, minute.